Welcome, or I guess welcome to me. You've been here. Michael, thanks for the presentation. Pete Rizzo, Bitcoin historian on X, host of the Supply Shock Bitcoin podcast for Blockworks. Michael, just want to jump in where you were in your presentation talking about we are watching history. This is a historic moment. The world is changing. We just saw a sitting president make an address at a Bitcoin conference, something that would have been unheard of even a few years ago. And today on the news, we have the Swiss National Bank making a statement about them not wanting to buy Bitcoin. We have Pakistan coming out forming a crypto council saying they'll be the leaders of Asia. So Michael, over to you. What is the risk here for nations that not just adopting a policy, that don't actually buy Bitcoin, don't start treating this asset as the commodity, the digital commodity?
Well, I'm an aeronautical engineer, and we design airplanes, and if you create a supersonic airplane, you create a shock wave. Supersonic means the plane is moving faster than the rate at which the air can communicate or get out of the way. So when something is moving too fast, you have turbulence, you have shock wave, you will have a lot of noise. What you're seeing here is the Bitcoin shock wave. This is going so fast. Every actor, every money manager, every central bank, every politician is going to be asked the question, why don't you own Bitcoin? And that is indicative of just how much power they have. They're not being asked whether or not they're going to put cobalt in the Swiss national reserves. But I think everybody with a pool of capital is going to be asked by activists in their own country, by activists in their own company, by their shareholders, why aren't you buying Bitcoin? And what you'll see is the world will bifurcate, right? You had an extraordinary, innovative moment in the White House a few weeks ago where what you saw was the president saying, we're going to embrace the future. And the president puts his finger on the world's first digital commodity and identifies it and says, this is not a bad thing, this is a good thing. We're going to own it. We're not going to sell it. We're going to get as much of it as we can get, right? That's a progressive move forward. I think you'll see that. You'll see other countries that will be regressive. I'm afraid of it. Why are you bothering me? You know, it's a nuisance. But at the end of the day, right, this is no different than embracing, nuclear weapons or explosives or ships or airplanes, right? The powerful and the wealthy and the prosperous will embrace the new technology and overcome their fears. And the regressive will resist it, they'll fall behind, and they'll be impoverished by their lack of vision.
Well, let's talk about the how, right? So the strategic Bitcoin reserve is here. The talk now is about how the government would acquire Bitcoin in the United States and some of these other jurisdictions. What advice are you giving to governments out there that want to move fast, that don't want to be impoverished, don't want to have their citizens be left behind? How do they acquire?
Well, I think the first thing to do, which is what our government is doing, is build consensus and awareness. It's really important, right, first to identify Bitcoin's a commodity. It's very important to emphasize it's got an immaculate conception. There's no issuer. It's very important to make sure people understand it's digital gold. It's pretty important to understand it's an asset that will enrich us. If you don't get that consensus from the citizens, the taxpayers, and a bipartisan consensus, it's hard to move forward. And I think that they're doing that. So what's going to happen right now is, I think, a very elaborate and very thoughtful political process to build consensus. And consensus building is educating. We see that going on in DC. It's not going to be, I wouldn't be in favor of like one jolt, trying to do everything at the same time, because there's that phrase, if you want to go fast, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together, right? And what we need to do is make sure that we take everybody along, and that's going to be a dialogue between the White House, the Cabinet, Treasury, Commerce, the Senate, the House, the industry, and then all of the major political constituencies on both sides of the aisle.
Well, one of the big questions right now is really how much Bitcoin does America have? Senator Cynthia Lummis coming out and talking about this. We think the United States has 200,000 Bitcoin, but we don't know. There hasn't been an audit. We know that some of these agencies have been conducting sales as they have been historically. What is the impact here if the United States has less Bitcoin than we think we have? What if we don't have 200,000 Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, the only thing we know is we don't have enough, whatever the number is. I think that we'll know more with more transparency in time, especially this year. I think that we'll put in place pretty good programs for managing digital assets, for managing Bitcoin. Certainly, I think by the end of the year, based upon everything that the president has said. I think that clearly the opportunity is that there's $450 trillion of long-term capital in the world, and it's all invested in 20th century bonds, 20th century real estate, 20th century equity, and 20th century artwork and other collectibles. And as the world gets educated, they're going to sell their inferior assets and they're going to convert them into Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin network is going to grow from 2 trillion to 20 trillion to 200 trillion, and then it's going to grow beyond. So the opportunity is buy cyberspace, buy Bitcoin, buy a share of the digital capital of the world, and then let all of the capital from the rest of the world flow into the network and enrich you. Capital from the 20th century in the US. I mean, someone with a warehouse in New Jersey, when it gets to the end of its life, may very well say, instead of renovating the warehouse for another 20 years, I think I'll sell it and buy Bitcoin with it. So 20th century capital will flow into the Bitcoin network, foreign capital will flow in the Bitcoin network, and then these AIs and technology companies are going to create tens and then hundreds of trillions of dollars of value. It will flow into the Bitcoin network. So the opportunity is simply buy it, buy as much of it as you want to own, and then allow the passage of time to enrich you. And then I think the threat is, right, the risk is, don't buy it. How would you feel if your enemy made $80 trillion and owned the network or controlled the network? The worst case would be they make 80 or 100 trillion, they control the network, they own cyberspace, you don't. And I would say the best analogy, and this is manifest destiny in the United States. When Thomas Jefferson was president, he had an opportunity to buy Louisiana. We didn't have the money, but it's not that complicated. You're on the East Coast and you look west and you think, do I want to allow the French, or do I want the French to sell this to the British, or do I want it to be sold to the Spaniards, or do I want to own it? So we bought it, and then we moved on to take control of and take ownership of Texas, and then the West, and then California. And where would the country be if California was owned by the Spanish and a third of the country was owned by the French, and we had been responsible in not taking risk? And so the answer is, it's the future, right? You may not, you could say, well, I live in New York City. I don't think anybody will ever want to live in St. Louis or San Francisco or LA. It's like a hard wagon ride from here. And you would be right, but you would be wrong. Of course they want to live in San Francisco and LA. You just got to look out far enough. And I would say, I think people in this room know this, but the average of the normie would say, well, wait, I can't live in cyberspace. I can't live in a digital energy network. It's like, well, maybe you can't, but the AI can. The thing that you create that's going to take responsibility for all your family's money, that's going to make you rich, it will live in cyberspace. It will look at you and say, are you crazy? I can do things 1,000,000 times a second perfectly, 1,000,000 times more efficiently there. But you want me to actually, trade copper tokens, at the speed of sound or something, or less than the speed of sound. So the future is there. The economy is going to go there. You can buy it. You can buy it for a nickel. You know, we bought 80% of the United States for $40 million, 80% of the country. And I think there's an equivalent opportunity right now with Bitcoin. So it's something you do it either because it's a good opportunity, or you do it because you wouldn't want your worst enemy to do it to you.
Right. Well, you put a number on the goal you have for the United States. You'd like to see the United States own 5 million Bitcoin, about 25% of the network. Do you have a sense then of how much of the Bitcoin supply could be owned by governments? If like there's a geopolitical order that comes around Bitcoin, how much of the supply would be owned by just the totality of governments?
Look, I think Bitcoin is perfect money, and it's the most profound opportunity of the 21st century. And the rich, the powerful, the comfortable, and the arrogant have no need for it. So I think the most beautiful thing about Bitcoin is it's money there for the taking. If you want money, if you need money, if you're willing to take the risk, if you're at the beginning of your life cycle, if you're in your youth, America was a youthful country. If you're a youthful person, a youthful family, a youthful company, if you're an ambitious country, then it's there for the taking. I can't really tell you, I mean, and the beauty is Satoshi gave sovereign money, which means that the rights of a cab driver in Nigeria are just as powerful as the rights of the United States, you know, in Foggy Bottom. So will the Bitcoin be claimed by individuals? Will it be claimed by corporations? Will it be claimed by nation states? Will it be claimed by institutions? And the answer is, I don't know, and I think that Satoshi just kind of gave perfect money to the world. Those who can overcome their arrogance, who need it, will see it for what it is, and they will claim it. And then others will be comfortable in their 20th century existence, and they will dismiss it as a nuisance. And you know, I've said sometime before, the volatility of Bitcoin is a gift to the faithful. The complexity of Bitcoin is a gift to the faithful. Because if it was simple, and if it was non-volatile, someone with more money than you, that's arrogant, that doesn't need the money, would have it all, and you would have none of it. You would have no opportunity. So I think it's in everybody's best interest that it remain a little bit complicated, a little bit volatile, and then the greatest nations of the 22nd century will embrace it. I mean, there was a time when the Chinese outlawed explosives and gunpowder, and the Japanese thought that was a good idea too. Right? And it lasted for a while until people that thought that explosives and guns and gunpowder and technology were an okay idea showed up and made them change that. They toppled the governments, and they were dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century.
But I guess, is there a number that scares you or might worry people? Because there are people who are worried about how much government involvement there is now in Bitcoin. So is there a number that there is no number, it sounds like, that changes how you think about Bitcoin in terms of how much governments could acquire, with China now looking maybe to respond to the US?
I put my trust in Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin is going to evolve in a very dynamic, very healthy fashion because it's the most ethical, the most open, the most ethically sound, the most powerful idea in the world. There's going to be nation-state struggles, but it's possible all nation-states ignore it, and it's companies that fight over it. It's possible that companies ignore it, and it's the individuals that fight over it. But I think I talked about ideology, right? Bitcoin is the triumph of the natural law over the artificial law. It's a triumph of the natural versus the artificial. Right? And natural law says what naturally should happen will happen. And those that are arrogant and foolish will dismiss it and they won't benefit from it. And I think that the question is, am I worried that the US won't embrace it? Or am I more worried they will embrace it? The truth is, if the US embraces it, it will inject virtue and natural law, and respect for property rights and freedom, and economic balance into the U.S. government. So I think any organization that embraces Bitcoin is made more virtuous, made healthier, and made more rational. And I think in that way, I don't really worry about, it's like with banks, right? Am I worried about banks embracing Bitcoin? No, the banks would be more rational, and they would be more equitable, and they would be more ethical, and they would be more secure and probably better actors if they embrace Bitcoin.
Well, certainly there's a lot of organizations here. I want to call back a few of your recent statements and just talk to the startups and kind of innovators who are in the audience about what opportunities you see. Obviously, you delineate between Bitcoin and the crypto ecosystem beautifully, but recently you've said that you see digital currency as being a $10 trillion opportunity, digital securities as a $10 to $20 trillion opportunity, and then digital tokens as a $10 trillion opportunity just for America. In the past, you've maybe been more critical of these projects. Can you talk about what opportunity that is? What is that opportunity, and are you interested in it?
Yeah, I posted this on my X profile on highlights under a digital asset strategy, which I presented to the president in the White House a few weeks ago. I think that the great opportunity here is to define an asset class, the digital token, and I think the digital token ought to be an asset with an issuer that has some utility that stops short of being a security. And if that's the case, why can't 40 million businesses issue a token with some utility to create capital? I think digital tokens for capital creation and for innovation. And as long as you're civilly and criminally responsible for the damage you do, as long as you don't lie, cheat, and steal, I think that there ought to be a massive token economy that explodes. And that'll get us to 10, 20, 30, 50 million tokens, and many will fail, but some will succeed, and then the world will get very interesting. I think that the brutal fights over the last 4 years were because we only had securities and commodities. I think that that's a false dichotomy, and there will always be confusion and controversy until we create a new set of assets. The digital token ought to not be a security and not be a commodity. It ought to be an asset with an issuer. And if the issuer takes responsibility for creating utility and for not lying and cheating and stealing, then you've unleashed the opportunity for 400 million businesses to raise capital and innovate. I think digital currencies ought to be designated as such, which is an asset with an issuer backed by currency. And I think that should be a competitive market. And I think that if digital currencies become competitive, I think things like the dollar will spread to be a $10 trillion asset, right? Right now, Tether is successful offering zero yield, and there's 150 billion of demand for it without being, endorsed legitimately by the U.S. government. If the U.S. government let a bank offer you a digital currency that gave you 400 basis points of yield, the demand would go up by a factor of 100, right? And the big winners would be the U.S. dollar and the issuers, and then most of the weak currencies will be replaced, and the U.S. will export its currency to the world. And I think the U.S. can export $10 trillion of U.S. dollars, but it has to take the AML, KYC friction off, right? It needs to be a digital currency that we can trust that moves at the speed of light and vibrates 1 million times a second and goes through 100,000 layers in an hour. That's what's best for the U.S. dollar, and that's what's best for the economy. And if you take that same idea to securities, why can't you tokenize Apple stock or a share of ETF? And if you do that, we will export trillions of dollars of our securities to the world, and then people will start to create intricate instruments to tie currencies with securities, with commodities, with tokens, and then you'll see $100 trillion of value created through innovation.
Well, winding down here, talking again about this currency, securities, tokens aspect of your framework, are these opportunities for strategy? Who are these opportunities for, and then who can gain from these opportunities in your view?
I think there's 400 million companies that would like to raise capital. I think the token is an opportunity for any company that ever wants to raise capital or create something new and innovative in cyberspace. I think that the digital currency opportunity is going to be for regulated banks and big corporations that are, that can file audited statements and get the trust of the financial regulators. I think digital securities, I mean, any company that could issue a security might get into that space, but it's like for the ETF providers and companies that are regulated entities. So, what I see is I see Bitcoin as the king commodity. I see 100 digital currencies. I see thousands or tens of thousands of digital securities. And I see millions and millions of tokens circulating, all of them on 24/7, 365 crypto exchanges. And all we're waiting for is we're waiting for that digital assets framework to be written into law by the President of the United States. When that happens, there's a Cambrian explosion of all these assets, and it'll start in the US. It will ripple out to every other country in the world. Everybody will copy the US. And if the US does it right, then all the entrepreneurs and all the capital will come to the US. And of course, that's the vision of the Trump administration and this industry.
Final question, Michael. You talked about the 21 truths. Are there still things that you're learning about Bitcoin yourself personally?
Every single day, I'm learning something new and elegant and beautiful and wonderful about Bitcoin. I think we'll never completely understand it. It's like the mysteries of the universe unraveling themselves to an astrophysicist. It's a lovely endeavor.
Michael Saylor, Executive Chairman of Strategy. Thank you all for watching.